Well, hello, and welcome back. It's good to see everyone. I hope everyone is home safe. It's been a while, and we miss you. So today, as we celebrate our fifth Sunday of Lent, we hear the story of a few friends, a group of friends. We hear the story of Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus and Jesus. And the story is probably one that you're very, very familiar with. It's a healing story. We hear about Lazarus, who was the friend of Jesus for many, many years, his very close friend. And it turns out that Lazarus has died. And Lazarus has died, and they send for Jesus. Jesus comes and again performs one of his miracles, the healing. This really prepares us, this sacrificial healing, this resurrection, as a lead up to what we'll be celebrating in just 2 more weeks with the Easter season. So let's refresh the story. We know that Mary and Martha and Jesus and Lazarus are all of the Jewish faith. And so we hear the story that Jesus, who is only about 2 miles away, gets information sent by Martha and Mary that Lazarus has died, only 2 miles away. And so when Jesus hears this, being that good friend of Lazarus, we think that he would drop everything and run right away. But what does he do? He takes his time. Kind of interesting, doesn't it? We say, well, why would he do something like that? You know, the average person walks about 3 to 4 miles an hour. He could probably walk those 2 miles in less than 1 hour. But he actually waits 2 days. 2 days. You may be missing your friends as well, too, as all the schools are closed and we head into this next week of no school. But we say that Jesus does this for a reason. We may think that if my friends were not to respond that quickly, with friends like that, who needs enemies? But Jesus is very, very specific about this. And the reason for that being that he wants to prove that just in fact that Lazarus is dead. That Lazarus is dead. For it was the Jewish funeral custom, and still is today, that within 24 hours the body of this deceased person has to be put into the grave. And so we know, as some of our funeral customs as well too, that back then they didn't have the science that we have today. There was no embalming. So we, just as maybe if you've seen animals along the side of the road, we know that after a short time that body will start to decompose. And so what would happen is they didn't have embalming fluid like we have today, where they could preserve the body forever and ever and ever, becoming incorruptible. So what we have is that now Lazarus has been placed in the tomb. Jesus with his friends waits and says, we'll get there, to prove in fact that he is in fact dead. And we've seen Jesus do this before. We've seen him go and heal people. Just last week we had the healing of the beggar born blind. We see that Jesus raises from the dead the little girl when he reaches out and says, Talitha cum. We also see when he reaches out and cures the child of the centurion soldier. So Jesus now has received word that Lazarus is dead. And he says he's not dead. He's just sleeping. Well, he starts to make his way towards Mary and Martha. And what are they doing? It says that they are all together there in the house. Now, they're not having a big party. They're, again, continuing a Jewish custom, which is continued even today, called sitting Shiva. And sitting Shiva means that for 7 days after the death, they don't do any work at all. They sit around. They mourn. This is part of their mourning process. They mourn and they tell stories and they grieve the loss of their brother, their friend, Lazarus. And as Lazarus is dead, he's in the tomb, Jesus makes his way to see his friends Martha and Mary. Remember Martha and Mary, we hear the stories of them before, where it was Martha and Mary. Jesus, tell her to give me a hand. Martha and Mary, who were such good friends of Jesus. Jesus is on his way to visit Martha and Mary and Lazarus, and we hear the encounter between the sisters, and they say to Jesus, Jesus, if you would have been here, he would have lived. He wouldn't have died. Jesus questions them and says, do you believe in the resurrection? Yes, Lord, in fact we do. We believe in this resurrection. And yes, that all of the friends are missing one another. Probably as you sit home, you're missing your friends from school right now. But the difference is this resurrection at the end. And so Jesus says to them, take me to the grave. Take me to the tomb. And what they did is they took the body of Lazarus and put him in a cave and rolled a rock in front of that. Jesus says, take me to that cave. And when he gets there, he tells and instructs the people, roll away the stone that is the opening to this grave for his friend Lazarus. But people protest, even though he is the Christ, even though he is the Savior, even though he is the prophet. They say, but Lord, there will be a smell, there will be a stench. Because remember, there's that decomposition of the body. One of the reasons why, in fact, we bring flowers to funerals. If you've been to a funeral, you'll see a lot of flowers there. And, it's an old tradition, it's an old custom, that yes, when in fact that body were to decompose, the body would begin to take on an odor. So Jesus says to them, take away the stone. And people begin to think now at this point, because this is Jesus' last miracle. We know his first miracle, that of the wedding feast at Cana, where he turns the water into wine, but this is his last miracle. And so he says, take away the stone, and they look at each other, and they must be thinking, what is he, crazy? What is he, crazy? Take away the stone, there's going to be a stench. And next, what do we hear Jesus do? He yells out to Lazarus, Lazarus, come out! They must all be looking at each other. He's truly lost his marbles at this point. And to their surprise, what does the story tell us? That Lazarus, who was tied and bound in funeral garb, who with white cloths, like a mummy, was tied, to their surprise, after moving away the stone and Jesus yelling, Lazarus, come out! What happens? Lazarus, bound and tied in funeral bands, must come hopping out. Just like the Easter Bunny. And so that's the story of this resurrection. This story, he's alive. That story of resurrection. That story of resurrection that we lead up to in these next 2 weeks. That we will celebrate in another way at Easter in 2 weeks. The story of death and loss. The story of friends. But yet again, that story of resurrection. You may feel in this time, this very, very difficult time of the coronavirus, as we're locked down, as we're taken away from our friends, as life is not normal as usual, that maybe it has all come to an end. But we believe. We believe in this resurrection that we see today with Jesus of Lazarus. We believe that this resurrection will continue on, that in 2 weeks, in fact, we too will celebrate the resurrection of Christ. And so just as that Easter bunny comes jumping along that celebrates new life, may we look at this resurrection, this last miracle of Christ, and look forward ourselves to our own resurrections, to the resurrections of our friends, of our relationships, of our getting back to normal. It's a message of hope. It's a message of Catholicism. It's a message of the Catholic faith and Christianity. As I say goodbye to you today, I hope that you please stay safe. Work towards this resurrection. Take this time to think about that resurrection and how maybe we too are buried in that tomb. How maybe a part of us has been lost, but live with hope that one day, in the very, very near future, we too will be reunited with our friends, and we too as well will celebrate and participate in the resurrection. And so I say goodbye, and you all come back.